Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Sukkah Daf Chaf Aleph contains one Mishnah all the way at the end of the daf. Most of the daf is discussing the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda as far as an ohel. There are two halachic issues as far as an ohel. An ohel, again, is a structure, somewhat of a temporary structure. It's relevant to Hilchas Sukkah and Hilchas Tumas Ohel. The Gemara is assuming that the two standards are the same for both those areas of halacha. In Hilchas Sukkah, if you're sitting under some structure within the Sukkah, like in Rabbi Yehuda's case, where you're underneath the bed, so if the bed counts as an ohel, it counts as a structure, then you're not in the Sukkah, you're in the ohel that's within the Sukkah. It doesn't count as being in the Sukkah itself. The same determining factor is the same standards apply to Hilchas Tumas Ohel. The halacha is that if you have a piece of mace of a corpse underneath a roof, it spreads tumah to everything else that's under that roof. But that roof has to be an ohel, has to be counted as an ohel. So for both of these, we have to define what an ohel is. Now the Gemara has already seen our Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda holds that sleeping under a bed in a sukkah is fine, which means that a bed does not count as an ohel. The Gemara is going to now go into the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda as far as Tumas Ohel. The Gemara is going to show that he initially seems to fit, but on further inspection it does not fit, and the Gemara will resolve the contradiction and give a few resolutions. Now, the Gemara will then quote a brief statement and observation on something Rabbi Gamliel said about his Eved Tavi. Then we'll get to our next Mishnah, which will introduce for us halachos of supporting the schach. Does the support of the schach have to be something which is not mekabel tumah, or can it be something which is mekabel tumah? So, we begin the daf. We had seen the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Again, Rabbi Yehuda says that a bed inside a sukkah is not an ohel. You're allowed to sleep under the bed, and you're yoy to the mitzvah of sukkah. The Gemara has said that Rabbi Yehuda in Hilchos Tumas Ohel says that something does not count as an ohel if it's weakly made or strangely made. That means, two examples. It's made bidei shomayim, which we've been discussing up till this point. That means it's naturally formed. It's not made by people. Rabbi Yehuda holds that is not an ohel to bring tumah. It has to be something which was man-made. The Gemara is going to show that he holds the same thing about something which is made in an odd way. It's not a normal way of making things. The Gemara is going to say that initially seems to fit with sleeping under the bed. Sleeping under the bed, Rabbi Yehuda holds is not an ohel either. But the Gemara will see we're going to have to limit Rabbi Yehuda's halacha about things naturally made or weak construction, and therefore it's going to end up not fitting, and the Gemara will resolve. So our first move is to adjust exactly where Rabbi Yehuda holds that something which is naturally made does not count as an ohel. So we've seen that he holds that something which is naturally made does not count as an ohel. That was on the daf yesterday. The Gemara now brings a contradictory brisa. This brisa is discussing the halachos of a para aduma and how you draw water for the para aduma mixture. Now, Chazal were very, very careful with the laws of tumah as far as para aduma. We were very stringent. We took a lot of precautions to make sure that there was no accidental tumah involved in para aduma. Rashi says the reason for that is because the para aduma has a special leniency in hilchos tumah, which is that it's full yom. That somebody who became tamei and went to the mikvah and just needs to wait for the sun to set, so generally he can't be involved in a karbanos, but paradum he is allowed to be involved in order to make sure that that leniency does not bring to a general laxity in the laws of preparing the paraduma b'tahara. The Chachamim took very special and high-level precautions to make sure that there was no tumah involved in a paraduma. So in order to draw the water, they followed the following procedure described in this brisa. They had pregnant women go and live in special courtyards that were prepared in a way that even if there might possibly be an unknown grave under the courtyards, it would not be metami them or the children they're about to give birth to. How do you take that precaution? So these courtyards were built over spaces. They were built over arches. And the halacha is that a tumah in the ground only passes upward if there's no space above it that's a tefach high. So these spaces would block the tumah from moving upward even if it existed. We don't know that it did, but this precaution was taken. Now these women would give birth to children. Those children would live there until they were old enough to be able to draw this water. And then they would travel to the Gichon spring, that's where they took the water from, but they had to travel in a way that would block them from becoming tummy should they happen to walk over tumah hidden in the ground that we were not aware of. So the way that they traveled was that they had cattle, they took a cow, they put a door on the back of the cow, the child would sit on the door, then he would go to the Shiloach spring, which is at the end of the Gichon, and they would draw water. How do they draw the water? So here there's a bit of a machlokas. So Tanakama says that they were able to get off the cows and draw the water, but they had to use the stone cups. Stone cups are not makabel tuma. Rabbi Yossi says no, they didn't even let them do that. They had them draw the water with a rope. They had them tie a rope to a stone cleat and lower it into the water to draw it that way. The machlokas here is whether they were obligated to draw it by hand or they could lower it. When the Torah says to fill up a cup, what does it mean? Anyway, so this is the opinion thus far of how they drew the water. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says they did not have the doors. They just rode on the back of the cattle, and the cattle themselves, their back, protected them from tumah, because the cattle formed the ceiling, it formed an ohel. The back of the cattle was an ohel, and the halacha is that tumah doesn't go through that. There is more than a tefach space under the stomach of the cow to the ground, and therefore it formed a effective ohel block. An ohel not only spreads tumah to everything under it, it also blocks tumah from rising above it. So it formed a blockage. So Gemara asks, if Rabbi Yehuda holds that something naturally made does not count as an ohel, how does the back of a cow count as an ohel exactly? The back of a cow was naturally made. The Gemara answers the contradiction by saying it depends on the size of the ohel space. Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be perfect, solid, man-made construction, not naturally formed, only if it's the minimum size, if it's a very small size ohel, which is 1 cubic tefach. Here we're talking about where it is larger than 1 cubic tefach, up to the size that the Gemara refers to as kamali egref, which is the fist of a man named Ben Avtiach, which was quite a good deal larger than a cubic tefach. Rashi says it's about the size of a man's head. And therefore, if it's that size, or if it's even larger than that, Rabbi Yehuda would agree that even if it's funny construction or it's naturally made, that does count as an ohel. So this is going to contradict the case of the bed, where Rabbi Yehuda says that the bed does not count as an ohel, but that's a discussion we'll get to later. The Gemara first continues this discussion here about the formation of an ohel as far as hilchos tumah. So the Gemara says, let's bring a brisa. There is a brisa that supports this distinction, that Rabbi Yehuda says a larger size does form an ohel even if it's naturally made. The Gemara quotes the brisa that says that if a rock is knocked out of place and it leaves a hole behind, that does count as an ohel, and if you have cracks in the ground, that counts as an ohel as well. These are naturally made. Why does Rabbi Yehuda say it's an ohel? So it must be that the reason is because it's a larger size. Now the Gemara has a kasha. What about a door? Why does Rabbi Yehuda say that the door on the back of the cow doesn't count as an ohel? He said you don't use the door. Why not? The door, I understand it's funny construction. It's not normally how you build things. You don't usually put a door on the back of a cow, but it's big enough. It has a couple of fist sizes under it. So Gemara gives two answers. Gemara says one answer is that you could use the door. He wasn't saying that you can't use the door. The door does qualify as an ohel. He was just saying you don't have to use the door. It's enough to have the back of the cow itself qualify as an ohel. That's a biased explanation. Rava says we have a different problem. It does qualify as an ohel, but we didn't want to use the door. Rabbi Yehuda had a problem with the door because he felt like the child who was sitting on it would feel too safe and secure. He's sitting on a nice wide door, and then he would end up peeking over the side, and his head would stick over the side. It would no longer be protected from tumah in the ground underneath him. We wanted him to feel a little bit insecure, so therefore we put him on a cow without a door. That way he's in a rocky, uncomfortable spot, and he'll make sure to stay still and stay completely above the back of the cow and not stick over further. There's a brisa where he says this explicitly. The brisa says that Yehuda says that they did not bring doors at all because they didn't want the child to be too comfortable lest he stick his head out. Instead, they had them sit on a special cow called a Egyptian cow that had a very wide stomach, and therefore the child was fully blocked from tumah at all. It continues and says when they went to the shiloach, they would draw the water over there. Okay, now the Gemara gets to the kasha, which is how does this fit with the bed? Rabbi Yehuda says that the bed is not an ohel, but the bed has a large enough space under it that should count as an ohel, even though it's makeshift construction. So the Gemara says that there's a difference between the bed and the cow. The bed is not made to protect things under it. The bed is made to be used on its back. The top of the bed is what's useful. That's a weakness in ohel. Ohel is something which is meant to shelter. It's meant to protect things underneath it. This bed is made for you to use the top of it, not underneath it. So Gemara says, well, the back of the cow is also meant for you to ride on. It's not meant to be used as space to protect what's underneath it. Gemara says, no, it is useful often as a protection, because the shepherd will sometimes rest his head underneath the stomach of the cow to protect himself from the rain and from the sun. So Gemara says, well, bed is also sometimes used for protection. People keep their shoes and their sandals under the bed. So Gemara says, okay, we'll give you a different answer. The back of the cow, the skin and the spine of the cow, protects the innards of the cow. Like the pasuk says, Or ubas or talbisheni, skin and flesh, you dressed me, showing that the skin and the back of the cow is considered to be a protection for the inside of the cow. And it says about Samas Vigidim to sochicheni, using the word schach there for the bones and the sinews, that's even viewed as a covering. So that's one answer to explain the contradiction between the two opinions of Rabbi Yehuda. Gemara now gives another answer, and the Gemara says that the halachic standards for a sukkah are different here. The problem with a sukkah, the way we define being in the sukkah is something else. Rabbi Yehuda holds that a sukkah is a diras kva. A sukkah has to be a permanent structure. That being the case, if somebody's under the bed inside the sukkah is a permanent structure, and the bed is a very temporary structure. People move the bed from place to place. So Rabbi Yehuda holds, if a temporary structure within a permanent structure, the temporary structure is insignificant. Even though it is in Ohel, and Ochas Tuma, it would be in Ohel. It doesn't count as an Ohel as far as Ochas Sukkah is concerned, because it's a temporary structure inside a permanent structure. Gemara says, but Rabbi Shimon also holds that a sukkah has to be a permanent structure, and Rabbi Shimon holds you can't be under the bed. He holds that doesn't count. So Gemara says, yes, Rabbi Shimon agrees that a sukkah has to be a permanent structure. He disagrees with the idea that a temporary structure within a permanent structure doesn't count. He says, no, the bed, even though it's a temporary structure, it counts as a separate OL, and therefore when you're under the bed inside the sukkah, you're not considered to be in the sukkah itself. Okay, that concludes that discussion. The Gemara now mentions statement in the Brisa. We had seen that Rabbi Gamliel said, look at my Eved, Tavi, he knows, is Talmid Chacham, and he knows that an Eved is not obligated to the mitzvah of Sukkah, and that's why he's sleeping under the bed. So Gemara said that Rabbi Shimon said we could learn from the conversation. So this is an important word here. From the conversation of Rabban Gamliel, we learned two halachas. So we learned that an Eved is not chayv in sukkah, and we learned that underneath a bed, one is not yotze the mitzvah of a sukkah. So everyone wants to know, why did he say the conversation? Why didn't he say from Rabban Gamliel's words? We learned from what he said. From the conversation. The Gemara says he's teaching you a third thing. He's teaching you that you have to pay careful attention to the conversations of Talmidei Chachamim, even though it's not designed to teach you things. There are a lot of things you can learn from them, and therefore you should pay close attention to all that. Okay, this takes us to the Mishnah. Mishnah discusses a case where somebody was holding up schach with something which is mekabel tumah, or possibly a different issue. So we'll have the case in the Mishnah and have the machlokas in the Gemara as to what the psul is, and it'll take us to the subject of holding up schach with something which is mekabel tumah. Up to now we've been saying the schach itself has to be not mekabel tumah. What about what's holding up the schach? So the Mishnah discusses a case where you built a sukkah out of a bed itself. A bed was made as a square, a box. You had 4 walls, and generally you would keep a board on top of it and put the mattress on that. Here you took the board and the mattress off. You just have a box, and you put schach on the top of that. The bed obviously had to be a minimum of 10 tvachim high. So the Tanna Kama says that's okay. Rabbi Yehuda says it's no good. It has to be able to a sukkah has to be able to stand on its own. The Gemara will explain what that means by stand on its own. So the Gemara begins here, and the Gemara says, what is Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning? So the Gemara says there are 2 potential problems here as with this sukkah. One potential problem is that this is not a permanent structure. Rabbi Yehuda holds a sukkah has to be a permanent structure. A bed is a piece of furniture. They move around from place to place. It's not considered a permanent structure. It's got to be something which is going to stay there. A bed you're going to move, and therefore it doesn't count as a sukkah. The Gemara has a second explanation, which is that a bed is a kli. A bed is mekabel tumah. You can't hold up schach with something which is mekabel tumah. Says the Gemara, what's the case that there's a difference between the 2 opinions? The Gemara says very simple. If you make a sukkah out of metal and you put the schach directly on that, it is a permanent structure. So according to the first opinion, it does qualify as a sukkah. According to the second opinion, the schach is being held up with sticks that are metal, which are makabel tumah, and therefore it's possible sukkah for that reason. The Gemara says that Abaye says that if you didn't put the schach directly on the bed frame, instead you had another frame that was holding up the schach above the bed frame, which just formed the walls, then Rabbi Yehuda would say that it's kosher according to both opinions. According to the first opinion, there's no problem of the fact that the bed is movable. Only the schach has to be a diras kava, has to be fixed in a way that you're not going to move. If you're planning to move the walls, or if the walls are movable, that's not an issue. And in addition, the schach is not being held up by the bed frame. And the fact that it's makabel tumah is not a problem. You're allowed to make walls out of things which are makabel tumah. The only the issue is with the schach, and the schach is being held up by something else. So it's
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.